Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on the effects of fake news. It is certainly has been developing as an important topic over the years, but I think we are certainly hitting a critical mass in terms of not just thinking about it, but what our responses to fake news can and must be. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I certainly want to thank the Nissan Foundation for their support of this project. This is the third of a number of community conversations that we've held, and we would not have been able to do it without them. So thank you to our friends at the Nissan Foundation. I also like to start our conversations at Tanenbaum, and I've more recently been doing this with a land acknowledgement, because I'm mindful that I'm in my home in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and this was the traditional home of the Munsee Lenape people, that this is not land that I was given, and I am mindful that I have likely participated in ways that may have been unknown to me, but certainly in ways that are known to me, in not respecting the history and the lineage of this land. So I just want to acknowledge that that is what has been the case, that I ask for the ancestors of the Munsee Lenape to think favorably upon this work that we're engaging in at this time, and that we might all continue to be mindful of the lands in which we walk on, who they originally belonged to, and that we're respectful of those lands. With that said, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. Very excited to welcome Dr. Sahar Aziz from Rutgers University and Michelle Koch from the Muslim Jewish, I'm sorry, I got my notes all mixed up in front of me, Solidarity Committee. Thank you. So thank you both so much for making the time for this conversation and for this sharing. I'd like to start with just some level setting and a little bit of a definitions, if you will, and how they apply to you and your work. We created a fact sheet some time ago on fake news. And one of the things that we saw that was that according to the Journal of Digital Journalism, that researchers had come up with 6 distinct definitions of fake news. And that included news satire, news parody, propaganda, manipulation, sponsored content, and fabrications. And so those were the 6 areas of fake news that they could identify. And I'd like to just give you both an opportunity to respond to, if these 6 definitions, if we could use these as a jumping off point, which of them are impacting the work that you do and or the communities that you work with? And so, Michelle, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me and having this important conversation. So the work of the Muslim Jewish Solidarity Committee doesn't directly deal with fake news, but more with the consequences of fake news. And we're open to all people, and people of all faiths attend our events, and we partner with organizations and houses of worship of different faiths. But as our name suggests, we do focus on the Muslim and Jewish experiences. And that is because, well, partially, yes, there's historical and global friction between communities, and we bring them together to bridge that, but also because these are 2 religious minorities who are the most frequent targets of religiously motivated hate crimes in the United States. And why is that? Largely because of fake news. I think the 6 definitions you mentioned have all been used to a certain extent against both communities, but certainly some have been more damaging than others. If you take the propaganda against the Muslim community since 9/11, that really created a false narrative and image of what the Muslim community is, of what Islam is, and that became an excuse to so much from just hateful groups and hateful individuals violently attacking and acting against Muslim individuals to systemic persecution like the NYPD, you know, and the surveillance program. That had real traumatic effects on people, and some people actually ended up limiting their religious activity because they were scared to be targeted by that program, by the surveillance program. So you know, in a country that prides itself in religious freedom, that can't be acceptable. So what the Muslim Jewish Solidarity Committee does is to create a space where the intention is to come and be your true self, but also to improve yourself. So we want it to become a way of life for everyone to feel this continuous responsibility to constantly engage in activities where you get to explore the misconceptions of the other that were created by fake news. You mentioned the resource material that the Tanenbaum Center created, and there was the one sheet called How to Avoid Falling Prey to Fake News. And the first thing it says is to go straight to the source. So that's essentially what we do, is provide a place to be heard, but where you're also expected to listen and learn and you know, debunk myths and misconceptions by having meaningful, in-depth experiences of getting to know one another.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michelle. Sahar, can we turn to you with the same question?
Yes, well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thanks for all the work that you're doing at the Tanenbaum Center. And as many of you may know, that I direct the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers, where we focus on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the US, and then looking through a cross-racial, interfaith, and transnational lens. So much of what we're talking about today is very much within our purview. And when we look at the list of categories for fake news, the one that affects Muslims the most, and those who are mistaken for Muslims, which could be Arab Christians, they could be Hindu in South Asians, and even Latinos, some Jewish Americans, you know, different. It's Arab looking, because there is a very simplistic view of what a Muslim looks like, which is based on news stories that are accurate news stories, but they're selectively focused on terrorism in the Middle East. And therefore, the only news that many Americans were receiving for the last, or at least the first 10 years after 9/11, and then it kind of surged back up after Trump, and we got into the fake news era. But it was accurate news, but it was through a very biased lens, and it was very selective. And so no one saw the doctors and the lawyers and the restaurant owners and their neighbors, who were just ordinary citizens and had nothing to do with 9/11, much less any sort of terrorism. So that's certainly the groundwork that makes fake news so effective, right? Now, with regard to the list, you have propaganda, you have manipulation, you have sponsored contact and fabrications. I'm going to show a screen very quickly just to give you an idea, because there's some numbers here. Here we go. With a focus on Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Now, Ilhan Omar is the US Congresswoman from Minnesota, mainly the Minneapolis Twin Cities areas. She's Somali American. She was born in Somalia. She's a refugee. She's Black, and she's Muslim, and she's an African immigrant. And she wears the headscarf. And Rashida Tlaib was born in the US. She's Palestinian, and she's also Muslim. And many of us know about the severe attacks that were against these two women, and it wasn't a coincidence, right? Because they were both Muslim, and part of it was for their political positions, but a lot of it was because of their religious identity and their ethnic identity. But if you look at this was a study that was conducted on the tweets between September 30th and November 4th, 2018, the midterm elections. 90,000 tweets about Ilhan Omar. 50% of them were overtly Islamophobic and xenophobic. 33% of the 12,000 tweets against Rashida Tlaib were overtly anti-Muslim and xenophobic. And 2,354 troll accounts created much of that content, and the majority of the accounts were bots. So these are coordinated, inauthentic accounts that spread fake news. So there is a very concerted effort, and it's hard to tell how much of it is US based, how much of it is based in other countries, how much of it is purely driven by xenophobia and Islamophobia, how much of it is what we saw with the investigations into Russia's interference with the elections, how much of it is influenced by the desire to divide our population, to cause us to fight with each other and to increase Islamophobia so that there will be political tensions. But Muslims are in the crosshairs of that. You know, they're in the crosshairs of bona fide Islamophobia and the rise of right-wing racist beliefs and geopolitical agendas that want to divide the United States as a nation and cause us to fight with each other by instilling bigotry and hate. And Muslims have been the scapegoat. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why? Why is it so effective? Why have these fake news campaigns, and there's multiple campaigns, been so effective? And I'm happy to add more to that as we go through our conversation. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sahar. And I think that that's actually a really great transition and setup for the next area that we wanted to discuss, because, you know, we talked about, you know, we've got these 6 categories, but in order for fake news to actually flourish, there has to be a fertile ground for it. There has to be some kind of fundamental idea that people are already walking around with that allows fake news to kind of confirm something that people already believe. Usually an explicit bias or some kind of bias that we might already have about another person or a group of people. So I'd like to ask both of you, and Sahar, why don't we start with you to continue the conversation. What are some of the things that we actually need to do to manage the stereotypes and the false assumptions and even the bias that we're carrying about each other that may kind of break up that fertile ground for fake news to flourish?
Okay, so again, I'm going to share a slide quickly because I want the audience to see these are the components of Islamophobia. So when you hear these themes, you need to trigger your critical thinking skills, because essentially many of the stereotypes against Muslims and other religious minorities, these same stereotypes were used against Jewish Americans, particularly at the turn of the 20th century and all the way up to World War II. It wasn't until after World War II and after the tragedy of the Holocaust that I think the United States started to have some self-reflection about its own anti-Semitism, which may not be, it wasn't as severe as what was going on obviously in Germany and Europe, but it was a very serious problem. So these are very common themes that are used against minorities. Monolithic, that Islam is considered as separate from and having nothing in common with other cultures. It's inferior to the West. It's, people who follow it are irrational, barbaric, primitive. It's portrayed as violent, aggressive, threatening, engaging in a clash of civilizations. That Islam is a political ideology that's deemed as manipulative, and that people who follow Islam, Muslims, do not, they defend discrimination and they are against democracy. So all of these stereotypes, these themes are commonly perpetuated or propagated within both fake news, but even in accurate news, depending on how the story is told. And so what I would like the audience members to ask themselves is, when was the last time you saw a story about Muslims, a story about a Muslim majority country, a story about Islam that wasn't connected to terrorism, that wasn't connected to security, that wasn't connected to the oppression of women, right? But it was something that was ordinary or normal or positive or praiseworthy. We're talking about 1.8 billion people. And the percentage of them that are terrorists is very, very small. And one of the ways that we know that racism is at work is when a particular group is judged by its worst members. So if you have one person who's a terrorist who is a Muslim, or 19 hijackers on 9/11, that should not, if they were all white and they were all Christian, the country would not have responded the way it did against all Christians, against Europeans, or whatever European country they came from. It would have analyzed it in context, it would have individualized the problem, and it would have been much more rational and narrow in how we prevented it, as we should try to prevent another terrorist attack. And so that is a very common phenomena in terms of how minorities are treated. So ask yourself whether you're getting a story, reading a story about African Americans, about women, about Jewish Americans, about Muslim Americans, any type of minority, and it's a negative story. And it may actually be accurate. Yes, this person committed a crime, right? Yes, this person did something that is morally culpable. But look at how the story is portrayed, and ask yourself, is this essentially signaling implicitly or explicitly that all people from that category should then be presumed to have those negative characteristics and presumed to also be criminals? And would we do the same thing if they were white, if they were men, if they were white women, right? The members of the majority, the members who have power in a society, and that's very relative, but those are the demographics who have power in our society.
It's really, really interesting, because when we do our trainings in and talk about the whole dynamic of stereotyping, we do try to talk about the idea that, our brains function in a way where we move information around and block it together, but the value that we place, or the judgments that we place on any body of information actually leads to that foundational stereotype that you're talking about, and the various ways in which Islam and Muslims and others, like that dynamic of making someone or a group of people other than, or barbaric, et cetera. We certainly saw those dynamics play out even with colonialism around the world, and the ways in which, Manifest Destiny came to be, and all, et cetera. So thank you so much for sharing that. And Michelle, so you're a little bit on the other side of this, at the real grassroots level, where you're dealing with, and your organization are working around the impacts that Sahar is talking about. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about how is it that you all address in your work the stereotypes that people are either responding to, or have been hurt by, or really see that they know they have the stereotype, but how do we work through it? How do we move to the next phase?
Right. Well, I think that, stereotyping has different layers, right? Besides fake news, there's things we've been carrying for generations. But I really believe that it can be unfolded by what we discussed before, going to the source. And our work really aims to make it a collective goal to put an effort to work on that, and to make the individual commitment towards that. There was even a study that concluded that a 10-minute conversation can reduce bigotry. I think going to the source, having personal experiences is really the most powerful thing that can be, from my experience as well. When I was a child, I grew up in Israel, and I grew up in Jewish community. And when I was in elementary school, I think it was 5th or 6th grade, my school joined a program where my class was connected with a class from an Arab Muslim village, and we were matched, like each of us was paired with another kid from that class. And it was a pretty short program, I think a few months or maybe a year. We had to take these tennis lessons together. We had some community visits. They came to our school. We went to their school. It was short, like I said, but it was short, and I lost contact with the girl I was paired with. It was before social media. I'm that old.
The time before social media.
Yeah. So as soon as it ended, But But what did always stay with me was that personal experience, that personal interaction with a Muslim Arab kid, same age like me. I'm not going to get into Israeli politics now. That's a whole different conversation. But there was always all these different narratives going on around about Muslims and Arabs, and that experience kind of always stood in the back of my mind. It countered a lot of these narratives, and nothing could dispute, what I experienced personally. And being that it was so short, I always felt that for me to really learn and go to understand the source, I really need to keep going back. It should be a lifetime commitment. It shouldn't be just a short experience. And that's also something that we're incorporating in the work to make it an ongoing thing. I really always felt I need to go back to that town. I need to go back to the school, connect again with the girl that I was paired with. And unfortunately, I never got to do that. But, here I am doing the work I do now, trying to create these personal bridging experiences for other people.
And let me just ask you a follow-up question to that. So within the activities that you are engaging in now, are other members having the kind of experience now that you had with your pen pal in your early years, where they're developing relationships and having conversations to explore their differences?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a reaction we get a lot. I never met a Jew. I never met a Muslim, or I met a Muslim, or I met a Jew, but I never had this in-depth conversation before. Because we always focus also on creating materials for facilitated conversation. So, it's never just a gathering. There's always a focus, and you're matched with people to sit around the table with people you never met before, and have conversation, kind of explore your experiences, their experiences, religion, whatever the theme of the evening is, and yeah, that's always a comment we've gotten from meeting people, and also from just joining spaces. Our Passover in a mosque event that unfortunately we couldn't have this year because of the pandemic, but that's one of our biggest hits. And the mosque opening itself to have a Passover Seder, I mean, that's something that always is really embraced and really opens people's minds. We've got wonderful reactions to that.
It's wonderful. Thank you. And, you're reminding me that, one of the things that wasn't a criticism, but an observation sometimes people who are newer to Tanenbaum make is that they note that we're based in New York City and that we're such a cosmopolitan area and that there's so much diversity here. But I also happen to be a native New Yorker, and I know that we kind of live here in silo and in isolation right next to one another, except for public transportation and other places where we must gather. So I do think that there's something really important that you're sharing about a space where people have the freedom to say that, yes, I may have met someone who is Jewish or who is Muslim, but I haven't had a conversation with them of substance, and I've just been kind of walking around with my own thoughts about who they are or might be. It's really great work that you're doing. I'd like to turn to another question, because one of the things that we've spoken about is the idea of the internet. And Michelle, thank you for kind of making this distinction between life before the internet and now. And we know that, and Sahar, the statistics that you shared kind of highlight this, that, the internet can be used as a resource and a tool. It can either be used in the simplest ways to talk about spreading hate and misinformation, but also combating hate and misinformation. So Sahar, why don't we start with you? If you could talk to us a little bit about how you see this unfolding and what are some of the dynamics we should be mindful of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to, before I respond to that, I just want to respond to the prior question about the consequence of what we're talking about, because I think some people, because this doesn't get in the news. So this is just, even I was surprised to learn this. Now, many of us know about the Muslim ban. The silver lining in that entire stream of events was that we had mass protests across the country. And as someone who's been working on civil rights as they affect Muslim, Arab, and South Asian, it was the first time since 2001 that I'd seen such a mass uprising. Now, part of it was anti-Trump, but a lot of it was anti-Islamophobia. But what most people don't know is just a few days after that, there was a Christian man that planned a mass shooting at a mosque in Jacksonville, Florida. And had the police not intercepted him, he was going to probably shoot a large number of Muslims. And when they went to investigate his background and his motivation, they found a Facebook page full of Islamophobic and other problematic content, but a fake news article about Muslims raping a woman. And also, if you look at the history, because a lot of people don't learn this in school, the Nazis described Jews as parasites during the Holocaust, among other descriptions that are pejorative and racist. The Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches during the Rwandan genocide. And now we're seeing in the social media threats of invaders, right? So you had 2,000 Trump campaigns on Facebook had that type of language. The manifesto of the Christchurch, New Zealand shooter that did kill tens of Muslims had this type of language on their social media. So I just want to mention that, because primarily also because I'm a law professor and a lawyer, is the law doesn't protect victims of hate crimes because of the causal connection. It's very hard to prove the causation, right? The hate speech itself directly and proximately caused this harm, and we have an imminence requirement. But even if it's legally acceptable, that doesn't mean it should be socially or normatively acceptable. And we have to acknowledge that hate speech has very serious consequences, even though it takes time for that hate to build up, right? And it takes time for it to eventually create what we saw in Charlottesville, which was nothing short of a KKK protest or rally or whatever, I wouldn't even call it a protest, but these are very serious implications. Now, in terms of how to counter it, social media is a sword and a shield, and I've given a presentation on this in the past, and the way that our First Amendment laws are structured is under this concept, which some of us think is somewhat fictitious, of the marketplace of ideas. It assumes we all have the same access to the marketplace of ideas, which we don't, because if you see who speaks and comments on CNN and who the editors are of the major newspapers and who the columnists are and who the op-ed writers are, they're not that diverse. So access to the media is not equally distributed, particularly among those who are of subordinated communities. But having said that, social media does do some equalization in terms of having different campaigns, social media campaigns and hashtags, no ban, no wall. There were other there were many different movements on social media, and there has been some pushback by Muslims themselves and Arabs and South Asians and their allies to write more op-eds, to do more interviews. But I think what we have to do as members of the public is really hold our media accountable, because there's two problems. The first is fake news, which that should be unacceptable. That is not eligible for the marketplace of ideas. It's false. It's a fallacy. It's the equivalent of how we treat defamation. You cannot defame someone. Any type of false speech is not protected. So that is where Facebook and Twitter and media outlets need to be held accountable and be professional, and whether it's through their reputation being harmed or whether it's through statutes that need to be passed. Because our society is harmed when we are peddling in fallacies, whatever the fallacies are. The second issue is really, even if it may be accurate, is making sure that, as I said before, it is not perpetuating stereotypes, and that we are engaging with our voices both in person, as what Michelle does, but also through media and through social media.
You know, one of the things that's interesting that I'm hearing from both of your most recent responses is And I love this point, Sahar, that you're bringing up about distinguishing the legal limits, right, around defamation, et cetera, and protecting speech that is inherently inaccurate or a lie or a falsehood. And it makes me think that, so when we look at kind of like the institution of this, that we're not necessarily looking solely at our lived experience during our lifetime. Because I think about, I mean, I hadn't thought about this until just now. When I think about Juneteenth, there was a lot of activity around the recognition of Juneteenth, and the history of it is that, you know, slaves in Texas, many years, several years after the Emancipation Proclamation, coming to realize that they had been freed for a number of years, and now they know. But it's kind of like we do kind of have this human history of choosing what we share and sometimes shining it up or completely changing it and transforming it and peddling it as truth. But now we have technological systems that allow us to do this on larger scales with huge amounts of people potentially investing in the truth of it if they have some underlying condition that supports that stereotype or supports that bias. So really, really interesting point that you're bringing up here. So I guess my next question is, and I'd like to kind of tee up our guests, that if you have a question, I see that someone has raised their hand, we'll come to you in a bit. But if you have questions that you want us to answer, if you raise your hand, I'll be able to identify you, and you'll see on the, should be on the bottom of the attendees list, you'll be able to raise your hand and I'll be able to see if you have a question, and or you can put a question into the chat box. So I'm going to ask one more question of our panelists and then we'll open it up to some conversation. So I'd like to ask both of you at this particular transition point, what do you think is really like fundamentally needed? And Sahar, you've actually kind of started opening this up for us to teach people. What are some of the things that we need to teach people about combating the spread of information? Michelle, you mentioned the fact sheet that Tanenbaum created, and that's available on our website. We'll try and share that in the chat box. But I'd like to know from both of you, and I also know that both of you are parents, and we talked a little bit about that in advance of the session. So I'd love to just hear from both of you about what are some of the things, or maybe the thing you feel like we should really be teaching people about to manage mis and disinformation. So Sahar, why don't we start with you? Michelle, we'll come to you in a second.
Okay. Well, there's a first, which is very difficult to change, but we have to be committed over our lifetime. We need to desegregate our society. We have a very segregated society along class, and it overlaps along race. And that is, I think, making it easier for example, Russia to come and divide us, because we don't have all the experiences that Michelle's organization is attempting to do, which is I know someone who belongs to these minority groups, so this is clearly fake news. There's something not right? And that's really a lifelong agenda item that we all need to think about in our local communities. The second is we need to, this is me as an educator, we really have to emphasize critical thinking skills. And there's a whole conversation about testing and rote learning and et cetera. But these critical thinking skills have never been more important because of the fake news problem and because of artificial intelligence algorithms that are now feeding us content on social media, on Netflix, on Hulu, we are now being fed and curated information and posts that perpetuate our interests and our biases. And that is also somewhat dangerous in keeping us in a mental silo, even just for our own intellectual individual development, right? So I think that's really important that we need to be focused on.
Great, thank you so much. Michelle, what do you think?
Well, one thing we focus a lot on is empathy and compassion. And I think that to be genuinely mindful of how we consume news and react to it, we all need to work on our ability to feel empathy and compassion, and you know, not just extremists or hate groups, because we're all targeted by these algorithms, you know, and to a certain extent exist within our echo chambers and follow a certain way of thinking, and then, you know, easily dismiss others. So even with the best intentions, none of us practice empathy and compassion all the time. We discussed going to the source, and that's very important, but we need to be ready to go to the source, and we need the skill and commitment to empathy and compassion, to be genuinely open to go to the source and be genuinely open to learn from the source. And that's something we really have been trying to emphasize more and more in our work. We have a leadership and communication program that does a lot of that work and has a lot of workshops. So if anybody's interested, you know, follow it.
Absolutely, absolutely. We should make sure that we're sharing through the chat box the link to both of your sites where people can find out more information about your work. And Michelle, you're making me think of something, both of you are making me think of something, which is this idea of empathy and listening and contact and understanding and critical thinking skills. One of the things that we know that's a result of active listening is the capacity to build empathy. And without it, like if we're just kind of hearing people without really listening to them, then the possibility of empathy gets thwarted. But active listening and deep listening, by nature of the design of it, really does encourage me not just to hear you, but to almost feel your experience and come in closer contact with what a person has been experiencing on a regular basis. So thank you both for what you've shared thus far. We do have one question that's come into the question and answer box, and I do think that I saw Kevin Biestich, I believe you had your hand up before, so we'll come to you in 1 second if you do have a question. We have a question here from Kay, and says, fear of attack by Islamophobes is leading to self-censorship and avoidance to publicly promoting work that reflects the values of human rights, equality, fear from want and fear, etc. How can we create safe spaces for messages that counter Islamophobes?
May I start in responding to that?
Sure.
Well, first I want to recognize the person who asked the question, Kay Gunyan. She is active in the Charity and Security Network, which is a wonderful organization, does some really important work. So thank you, Kay, for attending and for your important question. It is a very serious problem, especially for younger people that are Muslim who are trying to start their careers, because there are literally blacklists that have been created. The Canaries list is one, which is facially, it's about, well, essentially it blacklists young college students, most of whom are Arab, most of whom are Muslim, for having any kind of critical political views against Israel, which is a state. Right? Israel does not represent all Jews. If anyone who knows Israeli politics knows that it is a very diverse political state. So that's one way to shut them up and scare them. And these are college students. College is exactly where you should be debating very controversial issues, where you should be sitting there and having dialogue with people who disagree with you in a civil manner, of course. But that's, as a college professor, I want it to happen in the university setting so that I can also help these young people think through these complicated issues and teach them how to engage with people that they don't disagree with. The other issue is we've got this Islamophobia Inc., right? Some industry, and Fear Inc. is a report that was created by by CAP, the Center for American Progress, and then they did a second one, and it's a very real, this is not a conspiracy, the facts are there. We're talking about low end 40 to 50 million, high end $100 million. All of it going explicitly to in perpetuating Islamophobia and attacking those, including someone like myself who is countering Islamophobia. And you can counter Islamophobia directly by essentially criticizing the Islamophobes, criticizing the fake news, or you can counter it more indirectly by trying to challenge the narratives and have stories that are more positive and humane about Muslims. But it is a very serious societal problem that we have, and you don't really know about it unless you've been targeted or you know people who've been targeted. Now, what we can do about it, the first thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge it's a very serious problem, right? And that it has widespread societal consequences in terms of creating a society that openly and overtly discriminates against a religious minority. And I'll put a little plug in for my book that's coming out next year. It's called The Racial Muslim When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, because I explore that very issue. I ask, how can you have a country that privileges religious freedom in law and in society be so openly discriminatory and racist against a religious minority? And there's a longer answer to that. I think we need bystander intervention. I think it's extremely important that anyone who hears something Islamophobic, you need to say something, right? It can't just be on our shoulders on Muslim Americans or Arab Americans or South Asian Americans, whether they are or not Muslims, because by design, this 3 to 6 million people in America, they're not a very large population, by design, they don't have power. That's why it's so easy to attack them. They're not CEOs, they're not presidents of universities, they're not heads of centers, they're not heads of the media. So they're easy targets. I mean, in many ways, the Islamophobes are a bunch of cowards because they're going after vulnerable communities. And so we need allies that will say, hey, that's wrong, that's unacceptable. You might not be able to change someone from being a racist, but you sure as hell can make it unacceptable to verbalize that and to normalize it and to say, keep your racism to yourself. And by the way, if you are an Islamophobe, no, we don't want to hire you. We don't want you to have power where you could harm other people with your racism through your power. So I think we have to just be cognizant, and everybody can use their sphere of influence to do that. And again, this is not new to Muslims. This is exactly, there was a whole reckoning, and it continues, of Germans and Europeans saying, how did the Holocaust happen, right? How did we get to a point where we're calling people parasites, right? And so fortunately, we're not there yet, but we're not exceptional human beings. America's like any other country. And so what worries me, what was worrying anybody else, whether it's Muslims or whether it's Jews or whether it's Blacks or whether it's Hindus, whoever it is, we don't want to live in that kind of society. We are going down a dangerous path.
It's really good. Thank you so much. Michelle.
Well, yeah, we can counter directly, like Sahar mentioned, and we've actually done bystander trainings and stuff like that. But I think to create a safe space for messages that counter Islamophobes, I mean, you also want the messages to get to the Islamophobes, you know. So a lot of what we do, or you know, in general, we define ourselves as non-political. That's a, you know, that's a complicated definition, you know. But I guess the idea is that we try to be open to everybody, and we try to invite everybody, and we try to, you know, not align ourselves with certain political views or candidates, or and try to invite everybody to the conversation. And you know, you asked me before about people sharing the same experience I had. And you know, a lot of these remarks came from these people who were hesitating, who came because they felt that we did create an environment where everybody that's curious, even if they're not a part of the community, can come and join and listen and ask questions safely. And you know, a lot of these comments and responses came from people like that who could not believe that a mosque, you know, would host us for Passover, and you know, had a conversation with me about really, you know, reevaluating the way they think about Muslims. And so yeah, that's something we try to do, to be open and inviting, and it's hard because, you know, a lot of times you're in a situation where, you know, you totally disagree with somebody who's participating and you really want to yell at them when they ask a certain question. But it's important to do that. I think it's important to face that head on and have that conversation.
Great, thank you so much. So we do have a question from Kevin Biosetcher. So good to have you on the call with us today and in the meeting. Kevin asks, how can we hold social media companies such as Facebook and Twitter accountable for the hateful content that is posted on these platforms?
I could just say that I really don't have much knowledge or experience with that. My experience with trying to reach out to them at Facebook when we were to report trolls, and you know that wasn't a very positive experience, and didn't get a lot of reaction. Yeah, but Sahar is the expert here.
So a lot of advocacy, and some of it has been somewhat successful. Unfortunately, it's successful because something tragic happens. Somebody has to die. We have to have a high-profile hate crime, and I think that's unfortunate. However, I'll share this slide that shows some good news, but we shouldn't be relaxed, right? All of this happened because of very aggressive advocacy. You know, Zuckerberg got dragged into hearings before Congress, and that was the only way, and many people still aren't, you know, advocates are still not happy with what Facebook's done. But here are some of the things that have occurred. Twitter in particular has increased its machine learning and automation. So a lot of these are algorithms to try to take down, because, and of course you've got this conflict with free speech, but free speech does not protect false information. Free speech protects unpopular information, opinion, but not false information that is being portrayed as factual. So Facebook has claimed, and we don't know if it's true, but they've claimed that they've removed 90% of all hate speech. Of course, what constitutes hate speech is then up for debate. They claim they banned 250 white supremacist organizations. And I think those of you who are interested in at least learning more about a campaign, there's a Stop Hate for Profit, because one of the dimensions of this is capitalism. Right? If it bleeds, it leads. So a lot of some of this isn't even just about malice towards minorities. It's that it's getting a lot of it's clickbait at the expense, of course, of minority rights. And then the advertisers make money off of it. The other, just quickly, there's one more slide, is Facebook has also claimed that it's prohibiting ads that allege that people from a specific race, ethnicity, national origin, religious affiliation, caste, sexual orientation, gender identity, or immigration status are a threat to the physical safety, health, or survival. So if they're doing that, that is a positive development. And again, the issue is monitoring and making sure they actually do it. And then there has been some new policies because, for example, there have been posts on Facebook that say ICE agents will be checking papers at polling places. So you can imagine how that is going to affect many voters who are in what we call mixed families, where the person who's voting is a citizen, but perhaps the person who lives with them either is undocumented or is legally here, but may have some other issues or doesn't want to invite ICE into their life in any way. So it's still a serious problem. I don't have a silver, a magic pill, but you have to advocate. I mean, what we're realizing is just sitting on the sidelines is not a luxury we can afford. And I'll give a little anecdote that I had told the Reverend about my own, children. Is I had seen a Facebook page in my town mom's Facebook page, or a post that essentially was saying that there was this, I guess it's shade is a term of art, and it was the town shade Instagram, and effectively this casting shade was used to bully high school kids, and high school kids were bullying each other on this Instagram account. And the first thing I did is I talked to my kids and I said, what is this account? Have you heard of it? And they said, yeah, we've heard of it. I said, do you follow it? And they said, no, we don't follow it, but we've heard of it. Everybody knows about it. And I said, this is unbelievable. Like, this is unacceptable. And of course, the position of most high school kids is they don't want to be snitches. And so I had to teach them that no, bystander intervention is extremely important. You would want somebody to speak up if you were being bullied, you wouldn't want everyone to go, I don't want to be a snitch and I'm not the one doing the bullying, so it's not my problem. But we do not know what our children are watching in those little devices. And that's just something we all need to be thinking about for the future generation. And there's a lot going on online that isn't as easily policed by parents. And so that's certainly something that's on my mind and is making parenting a much more laborious task than it already is.
well, you certainly have our support as you engage in that task, both of you, because I know that you're both raising children. I also wanted to add to the comments that you made, Sahar, that we also have at Tanenbaum 2 resources that we hope are helpful in this overall process, which none of us has the exact answer for. 2 fact sheets that we have, one to combat how to combat extremism on social media, which gives some concrete steps on like things that you can do within your own social media feed, and also 5 ways to counter extremists on social media. So there's a little bit more of a how-to resource that when you're engaging with extremists on social media or they find their way into your feed, how to engage with them to actually have a little bit more control of the conversation as opposed to just responding and constantly hitting the ball back across the net, but taking ownership of the court, if you will. So those are just 2 resources that we wanted to add about or to speak about. I know that Betty, you had your hand up at one time, is that right? If you can unmute yourself or put your question into the Q&A, that would be great. Are you able to unmute yourself, Betty?
I think so. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
So I think Sara just segued into my question. I know Michelle referenced in her early life experience with diversity, and we've definitely seen young people lead in social movements now, from gun regulation to environmental crisis work to the Black Lives Matter movement. So I wondered do you think the responsibility and or the impact is of the adults around children, especially parents and educators, for the early learning in anti-Islamophobia, and especially given the conversations now around anti-white supremacy?
Michelle, do you want to start?
Well, you know, we actually get more and more people reaching out to us, asking if we provide these kind of programs for kids. I think that parents are worried about what their kids are seeing, and they want them, they always ask about our programs, and if we have like similar things for children, they want them to experience that. I think, you know, it's something that we're considering more and more because they're encountering it earlier and earlier. You know, we can't control what they see on the devices. So it's something that we've been thinking about adding to our programming.
So I think it's gotten to the point where all parents have to become conversant in these apps that essentially restrict what your kids can see based on themes. Now I know that kids can hack into it and they usually outsmart us because they're of a much more technologically savvy generation. But I just think it's become a requirement for us, whether it's the schools help us and train us to do it, we self-train ourselves, but we're no longer in a position where we can watch, you know, when they're watching television in a television, which is blasé for them. They don't watch TV anymore, right? They only watch their iPhones or their computers. Usually when we're not around and we can't see those screens, we would be able to monitor that. So we need some kind of, you know, training or just institutionalization of these programs. The other is I think we have to be proactive because we have to just assume, unfortunately, that our children are going to be exposed to ideas and content that we will find highly offensive, and that we would, if we had control over their environment, would do everything we can not to expose them to those things, you know, whether it's pornography, whether it's racism, whether it's fake news. But I think we're naive in thinking that they're not being exposed to that content. The only alternative is to not give them any iPhones, and good luck with that. I was able to postpone my children for 2 years, and I was enemy #1 for a very long time. But at some point, you also need to contact them when they're not around for safety issues. But I think if we can figure out a way to address that at a young age and prepare them for it, and essentially say, here's what you do if these types of things happen. And finally, the anonymity of online engagement, this affects adults as well, can really change people's behavior for the worst. And that's something that takes a lot of conscious thinking about, is the things that you would write in a tweet, or that you would write in a message, or that you would post. Would you actually do that if that person was in front of you? And the answer is usually no, especially if it's rude or obnoxious or insulting or bullying. And then finally, schools are dealing with this now. Whether they're doing it effectively or not is a different issue. But cyberbullying is now the norm, right? Cyberbullying is here to stay. And it's got to be a staple part of any kind of child learning, starting from elementary school to prepare them, and then definitely middle school. And most of the kids have these devices at that point.
Great, thank you, Sahar. So we have this question is going to be our last question. I also just want to throw in, one of the things that we do in all of our work is to have people also consider that they are not just victim, but when are the opportunities where they are the perpetrator. And the other thing too that I think we want to be mindful around young people is that, yes, we want to protect them, but we also want to be mindful and have them be responsible about when they are the perpetrator, whether conscious or by the absence of them standing up and being a bystander or an ally. So I think that both of those dynamics are important. That's my sermon for the day. And then I'm just going to read this question from Gregory. Thank you for your question, and yours will be the last one for our session today. I've seen a lot of friends with queer and anti-racist accounts on social media shadow banned because the algorithms that look for hate speech count reclaimed slurs as hate speech, and because they do not take into account systems of power, i.e. anti-racist accounts are shadow banned for rightly placing the blame of white supremacy at the feet of white people. How can we push for honesty even on social media without relying on corporations to develop algorithms to regulate themselves? So that's a lot of question for a 30-second response. Sahar, I'm giving it to you.
Okay. So first, I don't know what is shadow ban, because I don't know if I understand that. Do you know what that is, Reverend or Michelle?
I do not know what shadow banned is. Gregory, do you want to try and take yourself off mute to give us a quick definition of what shadow banning is? Are you able to unmute yourself? I can see you there. Yeah,
there we go. Am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted now.
Okay, shadow banned is when accounts become unsearchable or unfindable based on the algorithm. So a lot of times, like, the account will continue to exist, but unless you're already following them, you can't find them. And often their posts won't show up in your feed, so that they aren't gotten rid of entirely, but functionally are censored.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Okay, that's helpful. I did not even know that occurred, so that I learned something new. You essentially have triggered the crux of the First Amendment debate, right? Because effectively, when you have corporations that are regulating speech, it can turn out in ways that those who want that regulation didn't anticipate. And so one answer, if you want to be a formalist, kind of a purist First Amendment advocate, you would say this is why there shouldn't be any type of regulation at all, and that no account at all, whether it was a queer anti-racist account or whether it was a white supremacist account, that they just should not be shadow banned, and let, again, the marketplace of ideas work itself out. It's very much based on notions of capitalism. And I don't really have an answer to it, because it's the same question we have with hate speech and, you know, do you want to protect dissidents? Do you want to have people who have oppositional views, even if you find them to be hateful? But one day those oppositional views may not be about hate. They may be about opposing the president, right? Opposing a particular person who's running for office. And now suddenly the hate speech agenda reasoning becomes the pretext for really quashing dissent, political dissent. And I think that the best way to deal with it practically is to get engaged in the process and the conversations with the technology companies, with Twitter and Facebook, because they hold a lot of power, you know, whether we like it or not. And to figure out a way to get into that conversation and ask, well, how do you decide if an account is shadow banned? How do you determine if something is hate speech such that you take down the account? How do you determine that it's fake news versus not fake news? And so the devil is in the details. But to think that it's not going to have some unintended consequence would be naive of us. There will be, you know, false negatives, right? Or false positives. False positives is more accurate, where we will have accounts, at least from our ideological perspective, shouldn't be there. But I will just kind of note in closing is, I do not support quashing distasteful or offensive speech, because, so I study authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, many of whom are propped up by the US government and our taxpayer dollars. And I've seen what happens when you go down that path, and we don't want the country to go down there. What I would rather have is a very clear red line on fake news. Anything that is false and fake, I have a no tolerance approach. And then when you're getting into the more offensive opinion, at that point, I think what has to happen is more access, more equal access, and figuring out creative ways to be able to let those who want to challenge white supremacists, who want to challenge racists, to be able to do that on the facts, to be able to do that through advocacy, and essentially let what we call the bad speech or the bad opinions, let them just become fringe, right? Push them to the fringes. What we're experiencing right now, which is unprecedented, at least within my lifetime, is that views that were fringe my entire life are now mainstream. And how that's happened really speaks volumes about American society. We should be worried about that. America's always had fringe views. Look, fine, you have fringe views, but you're fringe. You're on the side. You can keep talking to yourselves, and you're exactly the type of people that should have no power. And I don't really care if you sit in your yard and talk all kinds of rubbish. But the problem becomes is when now you're influencing public opinion, you're influencing politicians, you're being elected into office. Then we have a serious problem. And at that point, we really need to have more access to that so-called marketplace of ideas and do the heavy work of democracy and education. And that's a lot of work, but it's worth the work.
So I want to thank both of you. We're a little bit over time. Dr. Sahar Aziz, thank you so much. I look forward to when the book comes out. We certainly want to have you back for an in-depth conversation about that. Michelle, thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing, for all of the work that your organization is doing. You're modeling the very behaviors and the actions that we need to take, so I want to thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for making the time available to be with us today. Please, if you, Sahar and Michelle, if you would like to share your social media accounts with people to just let them know how to follow you, how to find more information for you, we will leave the chat box open for a moment. And our friends at Nissan Foundation, thank you again for your support of this work. We certainly have all enriched ourselves through these conversations. This conversation is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube page likely by Monday or Tuesday. Thank you all so much. And for those belated Shana Tova, Happy New Year to you, and have an easy fast coming up. And I hope that it is a time of meaningful reflection for you. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful weekend.